Okay, in the last video in this section, we're going to talk about creating and configuring your board. This is the board view that you're going to use when you're running a sprint. All right, so we're going to talk about the differences between a virtual Scrum board that you're going to see in Jira and an actual Scrum board. The columns that you're going to see will represent workflow states, and we're going to talk about how to use those to replicate your workflow and then how to modify your workflow within Jira in order to allow that. We'll talk a little bit about swim lanes and estimation options, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the other configuration options. I think swim lanes and estimation are the most important, so I highlighted those here. So let's go ahead and go over to Jira. Now you can see what I've done here is I've actually taken our items that were not in our ready sprint. They have not been refined, and I've taken those and pulled them into a sprint 0, which is a test sprint. This will eventually be the sprint that we're going to put on our sprint board, but in the meantime, we have to get our board ready. Now you see what I've done here is I've actually assigned story point values as well to each of these stories. You'll see those over here in the gray. You can also see them here in the preview pane as well. So this right here represents our active sprints. Now this is going to eventually be our board. If I hit start sprint, these items would then appear on this active sprint board. But let's just take a look at this board before we start a sprint, okay? Now, a physical Scrum board would be a whiteboard with columns on it. Each one of those columns would represent the different steps in your workflow. And you can see in its simplest form, we've got things that need to be done, we've got things that are in progress, and we've got things that have been completed, all right? Our quick filters are also available for us. You can see we have the ability to take a look at that this way. And a lot of times what we'll want to do is actually set up all of the different team members that are going to be working on stories in this sprint and put them across the top here so that as we're going through a daily Scrum, we can actually click on each name and we can look at just the items for that person and try and figure out if there are any impediments, right? Which is the role of the Scrum Master as we move through a Scrum sprint. So I'd like to add a testing step in the workflow here. So I think that things should be to do and then they'll be done in progress. Now, once they've been worked on, I think they need to be tested before they're considered done. And that way we can maintain a high level of quality. And we have testers inside of our Scrum team. So that's going to work out just fine because we can actually move a card into that testing column and we can have one of the testers help us with testing that. So if we move into the upper right corner here, you can see these three ellipses here. So let's go into board settings. And let's take a look at these. Now we were in here already setting up a quick filter for our test component. So that's the page that we landed on here. But if we look under general settings for our board, you can see here we have things like our board name, and we can change that. That appears here. The administrators, the location. We can actually create queries and generate boards from our queries, okay? But right now we're just using the Jira default one for this project, which is the FP1 board. You can see here we have the project, here's the query, and you can see we've actually got multiple projects that we can put into a board as well. But we're going to leave all these settings as they are. Next, we'll take a look at columns. Now, this is the thing that I wanted to modify, right? I wanted to add a testing step in my workflow. Now, in order to add a new column, you'll need another status, all right? Now, I've created this testing status in my workflow. And the way you need to do that is you come over to the workflow. You'll remember the workflow from a previous video in this series that we did. We can take a look at these workflows. Now, we can take a look at it by selecting that edit icon. And you can see here what I've done is I've actually created a testing step. And any of these steps can transition into this step. Okay? So basically, we've got this testing step, and I'm allowing all statuses to transition to this one. And I've saved this out. So now I have this in my workflow. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to our project. So we're going to come back into issues to settings. Let's go to projects. We're going to go back to our first project. All right, so now we're back at the board for our first project. Now that we've created that step in the workflow, if we come back into our board settings, into the columns, I can now add a column and I can say, I want to call this column testing. Now, you can see this column won't show on the board without a status, but that's okay because I created that status in the workflow. So now I can move that in here. So now I have to do, in progress, testing, and done. If I go back to the board, you'll see I have a testing column now, right? To do, in progress, testing, and done. So I've created that step in the workflow. Next, we can take a look at swim lanes. Now, swim lanes actually cut across a board, okay? And you can use those in a variety of different ways, and Jira's given you some options to do that. A lot of times what you might do is for assignees or epics or stories. If you've got stories with subtasks underneath them, then your subtask will be what will show on the board, and you can expand and collapse the stories in swim lanes. So we'll leave it at stories for now. We can also come in here, we already talked about quick filters. You've got some capabilities to modify card colors based on things like this. So in other words, if you've got a high priority card, because the priority is set to high, critical, you can have it change colors. You can also change the items that appear on your card, and you can show 3 additional fields. This allows you to pick what those 3 additional fields might be. I'm going to go ahead and leave it at default. And then we've got estimation. All right, now when I do Scrum, I measure my velocity in story points, and I really don't use time. I found that relative estimation is much more effective than time estimation, but lots of teams do still use time to do estimations. If you do, and you're burning down hours, this would be where you would want to make that change. So you would want a remaining estimate and time spent, so you'd select this item, and then you could do, your estimation would be original time estimate. And then working days, as you might imagine, is really about setting the working days for the group that's going to be using this board. All right, so now that we've configured all of that stuff, we've got our board ready to go. We've got our sprints with items in them. I think we're probably about ready to start a sprint, and that's what's going to happen in the next section. But in this section, let's talk about what we learned. So we really spent our time in section 2 talking about all of the work items, right? So we talked about what epics, stories, bugs, and tasks are, and how to use each one of those things. What are they? Why would we use one versus the other? We talked about the different work item attributes that are available to you and for each issue type, and then what they are and how to add or remove them so that you can configure Jira to meet the needs of your team. Then we talked about how to manage the items that are in your backlog, right? Prioritization, assigning to edit, assigning to epics, and versions, etc. We talked about what a board is, and we talked about how to configure that board, right? So that the workflow matches your workflow, and how to effectively manage those items as they go through a sprint. All right. In the next section, we're going to go ahead and start our project. So be sure and come back for that one.